Welcome to My Week, and thanks so much for joining us. I'm Christy McDonald. A busy week as we head closer to the holiday. Last-minute deals in Lansing are making for some pretty interesting debates statewide. We're going to take a look at what lawmakers are scrambling to do. But first tonight, we focus on the state of education in Michigan, from school districts that are operating with a deficit to legislation that would hold back third graders who can't read, to teacher evaluations and the expansion of the Education Achievement Authority. What does education reform really look like, and are we on the right path? We recently sat down with State Superintendent Mike Flanagan for some answers. We have 55 school districts that are operating at a deficit, and we saw what happened at the end of last year with Buena Vista and with Inkster and the fact that they had to be dissolved. Where is the conversation right now at the state level about consolidating districts and looking at the countywide districts?
Well, you know, I appreciate actually some of the folks sitting right here, both papers, for supporting the idea that I was trying to get on the table. We don't need as many districts. We certainly don't need as many ISDs. We've kind of changed the position in the sense that if ISDs can't offer it, then their district should be allowed to go somewhere else. Where does it stand legislatively? I think all this other stuff has taken the air out a little bit for now. So I'm disappointed that there doesn't seem to be any legislative activity around that.
All right, so when you say other stuff, what do you think is the top priority right now that the legislature is focusing on? We're talking about teachers, and we're also talking about literacy for third graders, correct?
That's right. I mean, the third grade reading bill, for instance, I think we helped get on the agenda that you need to learn to read by third grade, and then you read to learn from there on in. So it's certainly the critical point for if you had to pick one education measure. But I don't think automatic and mandatory retention is the way to go, and that bill is being taken up as we speak.
But Mike, Michigan retains fewer third graders than most other states, particularly the states that are more successful than we are in education. If a child isn't reading at grade level by grade 3, should you just automatically promote them? What's the answer if it's not retention?
No, you're right, Nolan. It may be retention for some kids. My only issue is it shouldn't be mandatory because the parent and the teacher, they can best see this. I'm glad the legislature is taking it up. I think there is a role for some law to say, what do you have to do? What are the supports you have to put in place? And if a kid isn't there, but you know, to just say across the board on a one-day test that you're back a grade. And besides that, there's really a lot of evidence that retention can actually do more harm than good. So it's really got to be done thoughtfully.
So what supports do we have in place to make sure that...
You know, I've been state superintendent for 8 years, and there's a little bit of a catch-22. We're a local control state. So we make suggestions, if you want to put it that way, about what local districts should be doing. Most of them have reading specialists. Most of them look at their data now. I mean, I was a local superintendent in Farmington Hills 20 years ago. We didn't look at data. So, I mean, things have gotten better in that sense.
But, Mike, before you can, I mean, you talk about it, looking at individual cases, and I agree with that. There should be some discretion, parents and administrators and teachers and what have you. But we don't yet have an effective measuring system for student performance in place, and that's another issue the legislature's taking up. What should that look like?
We need to get rid of MEEP. I mean, it's outdated.
So what do you replace MEEP with?
Well, you know, I'm going to carefully say this because we think the only thing in the pipeline is something we've been working on for 3 years called Smarter Balance. But we just did a report to the legislature. Sounds like a what?
A butter.
Butter, yeah. We probably could rename. We are going to rename it, by the way. Whatever we get, whether it's Smarter Balance, ACT, because as long as they have something aligned to the Common Core, now that we're through that battle, we need a test that aligns to the Common Core. We want to move it from the fall to the spring, so you actually can measure growth during the year. It will be a growth measure, but I want to be careful again. Smarter Balance is the only one we know that's going to be ready. If others are ready, we're going to have to go for bid anyway, and we'll take whatever the...
Will it move us away from a test that measures sort of rote learning, memorization, and toward sort of aptitude and...
Even more, yeah, aptitude, but the complexity of the sophistication of these tests now and what you can do, it's like everything else that's changed in the last 10 years. We can get right down to where a kid is, and then you can eventually tie it into a fair measure for teachers. I'm for teachers being evaluated, but not with the current system. The only way they can be evaluated fairly is, have you gotten growth over time with your kids, you know, on average.
And one of the advantages of that Smarter Balance test and those other tests is that they are nationally normed, so that you're not just looking at how a kid does on the test, but how they do in comparison to other kids around the country.
That's right, Stephen. I mean, this will be the first time, because when kids are doing well in the MEP, you don't know what that means in terms of, I mean, look at some of the international stuff that's come in. I'm always a little embarrassed, I guess, you know, because I'm thinking, crap, I've been doing this and we're still in this situation where internationally we look very weak. I would say this, and it may sound a little defensive, we do educate all our kids. We do test all our kids. I've been to Finland and to study their system. It's half the size of Michigan. There's really no poverty to speak of. They're very good at getting high-quality teachers. It's such a prestigious profession there that they just get the top of their class. We recently, you may have seen, this is my call, and I changed the cut scores for getting certified as a teacher. It's much tougher.
And hang on, I do want to throw out some of the numbers on that so we all know what we're talking about. The recent state certification exams, only 45% passed the math portion, 31% passed the writing, and the overall pass percentage was 26%. So what does this say then about the college programs and about the preparation for these teachers?
They're weak.
Because the numbers are hurtful.
Right. First of all, we have 32 of them, so I probably should back up a little bit. They're not all weak. But they should be accountable like everyone else in the system right now. They're the only folks that aren't. So we've redone our ratings. I last year took action to close down part of Lake Superior State's program and part of Olivet's program. And I'm not afraid to do this with others if they don't get their act together. Because what they do then is we have 100,000 teachers. We're picking up about 4,000 or 5,000 new ones a year. You put them in a classroom and they're not prepared, and then they're under a very high accountability system where you can be fired if you're not getting student achievement growth. They have to be connected. So back to the testing for a minute. We can even do this year where we can connect the dots between, let's say, all the science teachers that were prepared by Central Michigan. And you can loop it back to, are they getting student achievement growth? And then you'll be able to say, well, what is it if Central turns out to be the best for science education? It's not a punishment model. It's, well, Eastern, you better be talking to Central. Michigan State, you better be figuring out what they're doing.
We're still training way more teachers than we need, right? I mean, should we not be closing down some of these schools and consolidating the best programs?
Well, if I was a higher ed commissioner and we had a different constitution, that's what would happen. But they're independent and they're allowed to have a program. But here's the deal. The change in cut scores is automatically going to move us probably from producing 8,000 a year to, let's say, 5 or 6. So we'll reduce it. I do want to clarify one thing, though. In fairness to this is a very small sample, this first test. So I wouldn't panic about that. And in my view, a little bit of this is still on the teacher ed institution. We told them 6 years ago we were going to do this. And then suddenly, to some of them, it's like a surprise that we've changed the cut scores. You know, a lot of folks didn't have any problem with us changing the cut scores for kids, where it was harder to do well. But my gosh, let's not change them with where higher ed's going to be rated.
I want to ask you about the EAA, which is operating in Detroit with 15 schools now. There's a lot of pressure to expand that to other districts, more schools. Is that a good idea?
Well, you know, we have the role in the department to decide what goes into the state reform district. And at least for now, we're still vetting schools, but my plan is in the next week or two, we will name some schools that will go
Name some other schools that'll go in?
But they'll go into the state reform district.
Okay.
And the reason I'm kind of trying to clarify that language is I'm somewhat agnostic about the EAA. The thing was the Granholm law, which puts schools into the reform district, is now coupled with kind of the Snyder mechanism for the EAA implementing or operating them. And, you know, the jury is out a bit, but I've been there and I'm hopeful. I mean, I've seen their...
You feel like that the things you're seeing in those EAA schools represents improvement?
I do. You know, I think there's a lot of controversy.
It's early, though. I mean, you got to give them some time.
But here's the way I'm looking at it. If let's say we're probably going to name fewer than 10. And they'll be around the state. They're not just
in Detroit.
Right. And by the way, if they're in Detroit, that's up to the emergency manager whether or not they actually go.
But they're all failing schools, right?
That's my point. I mean, we're only going to do this first year especially if there's absolutely no improvement in 3 years. So what do you got to do?
Why not shut them down, Mike? We got, particularly in Detroit, you have way more seats, classroom seats, than you need. You're taking your worst schools, instead of shutting them down, You're spending all this effort to rehabilitate them. Why not shut down those schools and then move up the line a little bit and make schools that aren't so bad better?
Here's the catch-22, and without, again, we're vetting these right now. I'm not just holding back. And if we don't vet them in time, we won't do them by the end of the year. We need to make sure we get this right. But there's one, for instance, that it's the only school of that. It's the only high school.
Public high school.
In that particular,
public high school.
Right.
Are there charters or others that would serve that community?
I'm just saying that to close down the only public school there, it doesn't automatically mean there'd be the capacity in surrounding charter schools.
There's a lot of talk about school quality. How many traditional public schools have you shut down for poor quality, for poor performance? Just completely close the doors?
Well, we really don't have the authority to just shut them down. So what we do have the authority under this kind of combination. I mean, what I'm hoping is, as we speak, I'm hoping the legislature will take up and codify the EAA. Because here's a hesitation I have. We're going to do this once we finish the vetting. But I have to admit, I mean, we need codification because, so how do they get out? There's no clarity about how they get out. When do they go back? Because many of these schools will improve under that model, at least that's the hope. And the second thing is, what if they don't improve under that model? Do I take them out of the EAA and put them back in the EAA? I mean, so there's still so many questions to be answered, and they need to codify this.
And to some degree, it's that we're going about this piecemeal instead of from a comprehensive perspective and saying, let's figure out, you know, what the standards are for getting in, for getting out, and apply it statewide.
Right. But we talked about my preschool grandkids. The schools that we're vetting, I wouldn't have them in that school. So no kid should be in that school.
Right.
This is just, to me, the simple bottom line on the whole thing. And we'll get barraged, and, you know, particularly some communities that might not be expecting it.
But Mike, how many years have we been talking about performance, reform, you know, pushing up new models for education? Why are we still here sort of flailing around looking for something that works?
Well, I mean, Nolan, in general, we are improving. I mean, the one measure, until, as Stephen said, we get the more common measure in Smarter Balance or ACT or something, is we do have a component of our overall system where it says everyone takes the ACT, and that is going up regularly. You get what we used to have, course content expectations, where teachers knew for the first time, here's what you have to teach in Algebra 1 for them to be ready for Geometry or Algebra 2. That kicked in. The Common Core was delayed. I mean, I was frustrated for 6 months with the legislature, but we're past that. That's really going to make a difference. The fact that I think the reforms, piecemeal as they may be, they've had an impact on trying to move us along. I worked well with Governor Granholm. One thing I like about Governor Snyder is I think there is a metric way to think about things, to hold each of us accountable. So that's helping. If you look at the measures, we're going up.
What about graduation rates?
Graduation rates, to me, not that we shouldn't pay attention to them, but I'm always a little suspect because you could graduate a kid who doesn't deserve a diploma. And I'm worried about the combination of a graduation rate with some confidence that the Michigan Merit Curriculum been attained, that they can demonstrate that on tests. That's the other big thing, by the way. The Michigan Merit Curriculum is not a small issue. It was listed as one of the 2 best in the country, Massachusetts and ours. So you get to a point where you realize we've got the right pieces. I think in terms of the EAA, we need some legislation to get this done once and for all. If it's not the EAA, that's for them to fight out, I guess. But we need a place to be able to operate. We can't operate them at a statewide level. But there are some schools that they're not improving under any circumstance, and it's only a handful. And I do want to say this. Part of the reform problem is teachers are feeling demoralized, and we can have a catch-22 here if we're not careful, where people won't get in the profession because they're feeling overly blamed. Most of this is systems issues that we're correcting. It's largely not the teacher in the classroom. And the few that probably should have another profession, so be it. You know, that we've got now an evaluation system in place. But that will not work if we don't have a fair testing system connected with it.
So talking about evaluations, what grade would you give Michigan's education system right now?
I'd say a B minus. I think we're heading to a B plus. We're certainly above the C grade anymore. I mean, I'm really happy to see how we're doing in terms of some of the things like I mentioned. Massachusetts gets if I can just say this, I saw Chuck Ballard from MSU. He gave a speech the other day, and he said, you know, everyone talks about Massachusetts. He says, they're lucky. I mean, the nature of all the higher ed institutions they have and the kids that already are performing in great.
But Florida's also showing up now on folks' radar screens in terms of making education strides, and you wouldn't consider Florida to be in that Massachusetts
I agree with that.
category. I mean,
we're doing some of the same reforms, as you know. We're a little behind them. Some of theirs started during Jeb Bush, and we're a little behind.
But how much does the political process slow you down, Mike? I mean, you're in a unique situation. We've got an elected school board, but the governor controls the budget. The legislature controls a lot of the policy.
I'm a constitutional officer like the Attorney General and the Secretary of State, and I just do what I think we need to do and let the chips fall.